Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Jaxley looked on as Jon rode towards the target and smiled as he hit it firm and dead center. For the last night, he'd been having Jon work on his lance work, and it was starting to show. His horsemanship was incredible, but his handling of the lance still needed some work. While it would be years before he rode in the lists, it was better to start as early as possible, and though some found using rings a good place to begin, Jaxley preferred to use targets. Rings allowed for precision, but there was no feel for how much force hitting something required. Far better to get used to the fact that when your lance hit something solid, your arm was going to feel it. He watched as Jon began to make the run again, once again hitting the target dead center and this time even firmer. He made his way over to the targets themselves to judge just how firm Jon had been hitting them. He was happy to see that they were marked, meaning Jon had been giving his all. He nodded to him and signaled for him to dismount, watching as Jon patted and whispered to Winter, the horse's name itself almost causing him to laugh. Jon led Winter to the water trot and made his way over towards him. Ghost, his ever-faithful shadow, catching Jaime by surprise, as he usually did. To say Ghost had a habit of sneaking up on people would be an understatement. Not only was the wolf silent, but he moved more quickly and stealthily than any animal had a right to. The only constant was that wherever Jon was, the wolf would sure to be close by. It reassured Jaime to see it to be truthful. Not only was Jon completely taken with the wolf, but the wolf, it seemed, reciprocated. The two were so close that to Jaime it felt like they had been together forever. "How did I do?" Jon asked as he reached him. "Good, very good, you're getting better. How's the arm?" "It's fine," Jon said as he stretched it. "Jon?" "All right, it hurts like hell. I didn't realize how hard I was hitting the targets." Jon replied sheepishly, "Well, take a rest for a few days. No sparring or lancing," Jaime said as Jon nodded. "Go get something to eat. We'll speak later." "And Jon, no sparring, is that understood?" he added before smiling and walking away. Earlier that day, he received an invitation to Lord Hightower's daughter's wedding in Old Town. He originally was going to ignore it, but the more he'd thought about it, the more it seemed like a good idea. He'd been going a little crazy spending all his time in the Rock, and while he had found he actually enjoyed his duties now, it was time Tyrion ran the place for a while. Besides, it would keep his aunt off his back. Ever since the ball, she'd been pressuring him to invite Lady Aksane for dinner or a ride or anything at all, really. And Jaime had no wish to lead the lady on. By going to this wedding, he could at least pretend to his aunt he was going to see which eligible lady took his fancy. But mainly he was doing it because it would be good for more of the realm to get to know Jon. Jaime casually walked back to the lift. He had no pressing business today and was actually at a loss for what to do. Normally he'd have spent the time sparring or perhaps going for a ride, but he found he didn't like to do so alone, as much as he had once used to. With Jon practicing his lance in Garyon and Tyrion in Lannisport, he really didn't know what to do with himself. When the lift reached the family floor, he headed to the small dining area, figuring he'd grab something to eat and head back to his room and perhaps do some reading or catch up with some of the less important correspondence he'd put off. As he walked into the dining area, however, he knew he was done for. There was no escape, no chance to duck back out. He'd been seen. "Lord Jaime, come join us," Aemon Frey said loudly. Sorry, Aemon, I was just going to grab something and go," Jaime said, trying to retrieve the situation. No, stay talk for a while. Lord Jaime, I haven't had the chance to speak to you for an age." Jaime reluctantly went and sat beside Aemon, dwarfing the smaller man by more than a head and a half. It wasn't that he hated the man. More, the man was a complete and utter idiot, and like most Freys that Jaime had been unfortunate to meet, Aemon thought way too highly of himself. Although given the match his father had made for him, perhaps in his case there was more merit in it than in those of his kin. "Lord Jaime, I was wondering if you'd given any thought to who may take over Castamere, if your plans work out," Aemon said, surprising him. "I haven't surrendered none at all, to be frank. I think it's better to see if the plans actually work first." "Don't you?" "I do, my lord, but if they do, then perhaps you'll need a strong man to keep those workers in line," Aemon said, puffing out his chest. Jaime had to resist the urge to laugh. While putting Garner in charge would accomplish a lot, Aemon as a strong man was just too funny an image. The fool had been laid up in bed for nigh on a week because of a rotten piece of fruit he'd stupidly consumed. Not to mention he cowered when Jaime's aunt came into the room. A strong man and the name Frey did not belong in the same sentence. "I shall consider it, sir," Jaime said, and smiled as he saw Jon come into the room with Ghost following behind him. "If you'll forgive me, Aemon, I see my squire requires my attention," Jaime said, and quickly made his way to Jon. "Say nothing and just look worried and nod," he said as he reached him. He noticed Aemon watching from over his shoulder, and Jon played his part well, the two of them turning and leaving the dining hall, the snack he'd come in to partake in quickly forgotten. They made their way down to Jaime's solar, Jon smirking all the way. "It's not that funny," Jaime said exasperatedly. "I think you'll find it is my lord," Jon said before they both laughed. As they arrived at his solar, he called one of the servants over and sent her to get 2 small meals for him and Jon. They went inside and he took his seat while Jon did likewise. After a few moments, the servant returned and she laid the plates out on the table. "Thank you, Sarah, that will be all." "Of course, my lord," the girl said with a bow before leaving. Yane found that once away from Sarah, he was suddenly more hungry than he thought he'd been. He noticed Jon seemed even hungrier, although he stuck to the fruit and cheese while feeding the meat to Ghost, who eagerly ate it up. When the meal was finished, Jaime decided he'd bring up the trip with Jon. "We'll be heading on a trip soon, Jon. Sorjara and Lady Linnes are to be married in Old Town, and I've been invited," Jaime said. "You want me to come with you, my lord?" "Aye, Jon, you're my squire, and besides, you should visit the realm when the opportunity arrives. Have you not wanted to visit the Citadel or see the High Tower?" "I never gave it much thought, my lord. Just assumed I'd stay in the north. But I'd like to see more places. Storm's End, King's Landing, Highgarden. But if I had a choice, I guess I'd really love to visit Dragonstone," Jon said, and Jaime felt a shudder down his spine. "One day, my king." One day, Jaime thought. Cat was furious. Breaking her fast had been bad enough. But listening to Sir Wylis sing the praises of the bastard had almost forced her to scream and shout, only the fact they were in public had stopped her. When he had said that the boy had been given a direwolf, she'd almost lost it, though. Bad enough, he looked more like Ned than Robb did. But to have a living symbol of the house also was just too much. But what had actually tipped her over the edge was what Wylis said about the king. When she heard that he had offered the bastard a prize for winning a tourney in which he had obviously cheated or used some trickery to do so, she had been beside herself. How dare he? How dare the bastard take what should be her son's by right? Robb was trueborn. He was Ned's heir. It should be him receiving gifts from the king. After all, the king was Ned's best friend. Surely he should favor his trueborn son. But hearing that he offered to legitimize the boy was just too much. No, she would not have it. She wouldn't stand for it. Neither her nor her family would allow a bastard usurp her trueborn children. Winning favors from a king, getting legitimized. She had never thought there could be anything worse than having the boy here in her home. But him out there using his bastard nature to ingratiate himself to his betters was much worse. She needed to speak to Ned. They had to put a stop to this now, before it was too late. She stormed through the castle, servants giving her a wide berth after obviously seeing her expression. She finally made it to Ned's solar and walked in without knocking. "Ned, we need to discuss the bastard," she practically shouted. "Cat, what are you talking about?" Ned replied, his voice strained. "He's doing it. He's doing exactly what I told you he would. He's trying to steal Winterfell from Robb. Maybe I should leave, my lord." Cat shuddered and turned her head. Woman Manderley sat at her husband's desk, and the look he was giving her was anything but friendly. He looked disgusted, and for a brief moment Cat felt shame. But it quickly passed, and the Lady of Winterfell shrugged it off. Why should she feel shame? It was the bastard who was trying to steal her son's birthright. She was only doing what a good mother would do, protecting her son. "Thank you, Waymond. I'll speak to you later," Ned said as Waymond nodded to him. "My lady," the lack of respect clear in Wyman's voice as he left. She waited until the door was closed before she got ready to speak again, but she never got the chance to. "What are you thinking, Cat? What's wrong with you?" Ned said angrily. "Your bastard is trying to steal Winterfell," she shouted at him. "Jon would never do such a thing, and my bannermen would never stand for it. You have to stop this foolishness." "It's not me being foolish. It's you. Your bastard is out there ingratiating himself with Jaime Lannister, and now with the king. Did you know your friend offered to legitimize him, that he now has a direwolf? Your bastard has a direwolf net, while your trueborn son does not." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your son was given a direwolf, Ned. It's bad enough I'm reminded he looks more like a Stark than Robb." Now he has a dire wolf too. You need to take it off him. It should belong to Robb. He's your heir. I have no idea what you're talking about, Cat. When did Jon get a dire wolf? Ned asked. Sir Wallace was talking while we broke our fast. He said they delivered a dire wolf to Jon. You need to have it returned, Ned. A bastard shouldn't have it. It should be Robb's. Cat, enough. If Jon has a dire wolf, then so be it. I didn't give it to him, and I will not be taking it off him. How could I even if I wanted to? What am I to do? Send someone to Casterly Rock and demand they hand over Jon's dire wolf. Are you even listening to yourself? So, you'll just allow your bastard to keep it. Are you going to allow Robert to legitimize him as well? Robert would never legitimize Jon without speaking to me first. You're being irrational, Cat. Am I? He offered it to him. Ned offered to legitimize your bastard. What's next? Will he give him Winterfell too? When will you realize bastards are covetous by nature? They want what trueborns have. He'll usurp Robb, and I'll not have it. Ned, if you won't do something about the bastard, I will. Enough, Ned shouted. I've tried to be reasonable, Cat, but you're speaking like a crazy woman. I don't even recognize you right now. I understand you have no love for Jon, but this stops. I'll have no threats made against him. Am I understood? He's trying to steal from our children, Ned, Cat exclaimed loudly. No, Cat, he's not. It's all in your mind. Now let me be clear. It stops now. You've gone too far. Listen to what you're saying. Even if Robert offered to legitimize him, which I doubt he did, then by all accounts, Jon refused and accepted the gift of a horse instead. What do you mean? Cat asked confusedly. Woodman was just speaking to me about Jon. The king gifted him whatever he wanted, a blade, coin, or a horse, and Jon accepted a horse, and even did that reluctantly. So you see, you're worrying yourself over nothing. Cat said nothing more. It was clear to her that she wouldn't get through to Ned. His love for the bastard and his mother was still too strong. She'd send a letter to her uncle and to her brother. They'd see what she did, that the bastard was not to be trusted, that he needed to be dealt with before he usurped her son. Jon, they were leaving today, and he felt a little torn about it. On one hand, he was excited for the trip, though not the ship journey to get there. On the other, he would not see Joy for a moon, at least. And he felt sad about that, with her lessons, and now that Martin and Willem were back living at Casterly Rock. Joy had more people around her, and Jon's absence wouldn't be felt as much as it would have been just a few moons earlier. But they had a routine, and no matter what Jon spent time with her, almost every day, he read her bedtime story, and the little girl found difficulty sleeping without it. He knew, of course, that as she grew older, the time they'd spend together would change. The nature of what they did would evolve, but still he wasn't ready for it to change just yet. He had thought about leaving Ghost with her, but the looks the wolf had given him when he suggested it had changed his mind. The wolf would be coming to Old Town with him after all. Joy had loved Ghost from the moment she met him. The little wolf was patient and gentle when around her. The first day he'd introduced them, he'd thought that he'd lost the wolf, such was Joy's connection to him. Joy, this is Ghost. Say hello to Joy, Ghost, he said as the wolf strolled towards her. Lolo host, Joy said, bending down and grabbing the little fur ball. Look again, pretty, she said as she held the wolf tightly. Yes, he is pretty, isn't he? Jon said while the wolf looked back at him indignantly. They had spent the next few days getting used to one another, and Joy loved throwing things for Ghost to chase after. He never brought them back to her, though he was a wolf, not a dog. Jon thought as he smiled at the memory. He and Garion had agreed that he wouldn't say goodbye to Joy before he left. Instead, he'd spent as much time with her as possible until then. He headed towards the lift, getting ready to join Jaime and the others who were waiting on him. He'd been a little late joining them as he grabbed a last look at Joy before leaving, finding the girl sound asleep. As he was about to enter the lift, a servant arrived and handed him a note from the maester. Jon, your package will be ready when you arrive in Old Town. Just seek out the Mermaid's Tail and speak to Captain Flint. All the best. Sir Wireless. He smiled as he entered the lift, Ghost already there, waiting for him. When Jaime had told him they were going to a wedding, he decided he'd need a gift. He thought about it long and hard, before finally deciding what to bring, but there was no way he'd get what he wished for anywhere in the West, and certainly not in Old Town. He realized quickly that the only hope he'd have of getting it would be using the Manderleys, so had sent a raven with a drawing and a request, more in hope than expectation. It seemed that he had been luckier than he thought, and as the lift made its way to Courtyard, he resolved to pay the Manderleys back in more than gold. His father's bannermen had come through for him quite a lot since he had arrived in the Rock. They passed letters to his siblings and father when he asked them. They delivered one of the presents he'd found for Sansa just in time for her name day, and they had brought him Ghost, he thought as he looked at the white wolf beside him. He owed them a lot and would pay them back as well as he could. As he left the lift, he found that Jaime and their accompaniment were already ready to go. He saw Lers Jars mounted already, and Jaime was saying goodbye to Jurian and Tyrion. He made his way over to them, smiling, when Ghost raced ahead to annoy Tyrion as was his wont. While not mean or malicious, Ghost really enjoyed making Tyrion uncomfortable for some reason. Here he is now, Jurian said as he walked towards him. All set, Jon? Tyrion asked as he tried to shrug off Ghost, who was attempting to bite his breeches. Aye, my lord, Jon said, grabbing the wolf, much to Tyrion's relief. Shall we then, Jon? Jaime said, nodding to the two men. Jon said his goodbyes and made his way to the cart, carrying their things. The journey to Lannisport wasn't long, but it was still too far for Ghost to make on foot, and carrying him on Winter wasn't really possible. The wolf had grown incredibly in the 2 moons since he'd arrived. He was now the size of a small dog, and given that he was less than 5 moons old by Jon's estimate, he wondered just how big he'd grow to. The journey to Lannisport was dull and boring, Jon thought. Ghost had seemed agreed as he'd fallen asleep on Jon's lap. When they arrived, they wasted no time boarding the ship. They'd be at sea at least a senate, and Jon was hoping the weather would stay fine. It would be bad enough if he got the sickness of the sea. He shuddered to think what it would be like if Ghost did also. Tyrion was relishing being Lord of Casterly Rock, and acting as Warden of the West. When Jaime had told him he was going to the Hightower wedding, he'd been surprised. His brother was not one for social occasions, but when he told him that as Lord he needed to care about such things more, Tyrion had agreed. It was one thing to dislike such events. It was another to ignore them, and Tyrion was glad his brother was starting to realize that. He had spent most of the morning working in Jaime's solar, and had missed both breaking his fast and a midday meal, yet he wouldn't change what he was doing for anything in the world. Tyrion enjoyed the daily grind of being a lord more than he'd ever thought he would, perhaps because he, in some ways, never thought he'd be given the chance. His father would have never given him the Rock. He knew that now, and while Jaime could marry and have heirs, Tyrion knew even without the Rock, Jaime had plans for him. That was all he had ever wanted, really. To be important, to serve his family to the best of his abilities and be appreciated for it. Jaime certainly did that. Always quick to give him credit, whether Tyrion felt it was due or not, placing him in charge of things that needed to be done, things that actually mattered. Which is why, as he looked over the reports of their trading deals, he was glad to see they were making a tidy sum. Most of their coins still came in from their gold and silver mines, but with the changes Jaime, he, and Jon had made, they were starting to see a larger return from trade. Also, they'd increased it by more than treble since Jaime had taken over, and Tyrion was a large part of the reason why. With that and the possibilities from the wind wheels, they would soon be earning more coin than they had in their father's best year. My lord, Lord Jurian and Lady Jaina have come to see you, Alex, his guard, said as he entered the room. Send them in, Alec, Tyrion said as he moved to place out 3 glasses. His aunt and uncle entered and sat down. Tyrion pointed to the glasses, and they nodded, so he filled them. The Arbor Gold, a nice vintage, but nothing special, he thought as he sipped his own. We wish to discuss something with you, Tyrion, Jenna said as Jurian smirked beside her. Of course, dear aunt, I'm yours to command, Tyrion replied as his uncle tried not to laugh. We think it's about time you considered your future commitments, Jaina said. I'm sorry, aunt, I'm not following. She's talking about marriage, Jurian said as Tyrion almost spat his wine out. Surely you jest, aunt. I'm a dwarf, in case you didn't notice, not exactly marriage material. You're the heir to Casterly Rock, and a Lannister. Any lady would be damn lucky to have you for a husband, his aunt said, leaving no room for argument. Tyrion felt a sense of pride well up in his chest. His aunt and he had always got along. She had never agreed with his father's treatment of him and had stuck up for him, and called his father out many times. To hear her say he was marriage material was something he loved her for. But she was wrong, despite the points she raised. He may even one day be Lord of Casterly Rock, but that would never wipe the shame of being a dwarf from the eyes of any worthy lady. Very well, aunt. I shall leave it in your capable hands, Tyrion said, knowing it was a fruitless task. Good. I shall endeavor to find a suitable lady. Oldtown. Jon. Arriving at Old Town, Jon was amazed to see the high tower itself. The structure was majestic, and he almost got a creak in his neck from trying to look up to the top of it. They said it stood even higher than the wall, and Jon would agree with them had he ever actually seen the wall. They departed their ship and quickly found their accommodations, Jaime having purchased all the rooms in an inn despite the innkeeper's protests, which had unsurprisingly disappeared once he was presented with Lannister gold. After a warm bath and a change into his second-best set of clothes, a black tunic, black breeches, black leather boots, with a white shirt being his only concession to color, his best set kept aside for the wedding itself, he made his way to Jaime's room as they would soon be heading to present themselves to the Hightowers and thank them for the invite. When he arrived at Jaime's room, he found he was already leaving and they made their way from the inn. Walking through the streets of Old Town, Jon paid attention to as much of it as he could. The Thieves' Market and Ragpicker's Wynd, the various little islands that made up the city. He looked down to Ghost, who looked uncomfortable beside him, the flowery smell of the city obviously not to his taste. When they reached the Hightower, Jon almost gasped at the beauty of it, the black stone at the bottom only enhancing it in his opinion. The guards bid them enter, and they made their way through labyrinthine halls, and as they walked, Jon thought that only a fool or a madman would ever dare try to take the tower. "This way, my lord," a guard said as the first set of guards turned back to the main doors. They followed the man upstairs and across corridors before finally arriving at two large doors. The guards in front asked who they were, and one of them quickly made his way inside before coming back a few moments later and allowing them to go in. The great hall was large and imposing, though Jon found it a little too dark. They made their way to the large table at the top of the hall. Seated there were who Jon assumed to be the Hightowers themselves. The older man must be Lord Leighton, while to his right sat a younger, almost identical-looking man, who frowned as they stood in front of the table. Jon was pleased to see Sir Jorah sitting with a very beautiful lady, and when the knight noticed him, he gave him a nod and a smile which Jon was grateful for. As he looked down the table, he saw Lady Olenna and Lord Mace, and who he assumed was his wife, and he felt his heart race just a little. If they were here, did it mean Marguerite and her brothers were too? He longed to check the rest of the room, but before he could, the steward began to speak. "Lord Jaime and Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. My lord, I bid you welcome to my home." Lord Leighton said once the steward had finished. "Thank you, Lord Hightower. I am grateful for the invite," Jaime said with a bow. Jon stood behind him just at his right shoulder as always, and he bowed when Jaime did. "We did not expect you would attend, Lord Jaime," the younger man next to Lord Leighton said with a smile. "I would not miss it for anything, Sir Beadler, for was it not at the tourney I hosted that Sir Jorah and Lady Lynesse first met?" Jaime said, smiling back at the man. "Indeed, it was my lord and my betrothed, and I are thankful to you for it." Lady Lynesse said with her smile beaming as she looked at Sir Jorah, "I am glad to see you both so happy, my lady. I wish you naught but good fortune," Jaime said, and Sir Jorah nodded at him. Invitations done, they turned to leave, and Jon was rewarded with seeing Marguerite sitting at a table to his right. Loras was sitting beside her, as was an older man who must be their brother. When Loras saw him, he gave him a wave and turned to Marguerite and whispered into her ear. Jon was pleased to see a smile appear on her face when she turned to him, and he couldn't help but smile back at her. The next morning, Jon got up early the next morning. They had spent the night enjoying the sights of Old Town, and the city was completely different at night. It seemed to come more alive to Jon, and the people seemed to enjoy themselves more. He, Jaime, and the rest of their company had done so too. Even Alliers and Jorahs had been given the night off, and after exploring the city itself, most of them had spent the evening singing and drinking in the tavern. Jon had even been convinced to play some tunes on a harp after Jaime had criticized the minstrel as not being that good. He had refused first. But after Jaime had cajoled him, he had finally given in, playing the Dornishman's wife and Jenny of Oldstones, though he had refused to sing either himself, much to Jaime's annoyance. While he had not given himself much credit for his harp playing, his tutor had said he was a natural, and after hearing some of the patrons of the inn ask him to play more, he had felt that perhaps he was better than he thought. He had declined, though, as something about Jaime's expression had made him feel like he wasn't enjoying the music as much as others. After he broke his fast, he actually and Jorahs headed to the docks to see if the mermaid's tale had arrived. When they got there, they found to his delight it had. He asked for Captain Flint, and told the first mate who he was. After a few moments, the captain arrived carrying a package which he handed to Jon. "Here you are, young lad, with Lord Wyman and Sir Wallace's compliments." Thank you, Captain. Please give this to Lord Wyman for his troubles and take this for your own. Jon said, holding out a large pouch of coin to pay for the package, and a smaller one to pay the captain. It's fine, lad. Lord Wyman paid us well to deliver it, and he requires no payment. Consider it a gift. At least take the coin for drinks for the men, Captain, Jon said, trying to hand the man the small pouch. But the man refused, and Jon was at a loss what to do, so he took the package and walked towards the closest inn, entering it with hours, while Jaws stood outside watching on as Ghost pissed against a wall. The wolf, seemingly deciding all of Old Town was his territory since they'd arrived. I'd like to order a cask of your best ale and have it delivered to a ship, he said to the innkeeper. Aye, very well, but it'll cost you, lad, the small man said, before Jon handed him the pouch. Deliver it to the Mermaid's Tail, to Captain Flint, Jon said, as the man counted the coin and nodded enthusiastically. Editors smiled at him as they left, finding Ghost thankfully finished. They decided to make their way back to their lodgings, although as they walked, the wolf seemed to get a second wind and rushed off to mark somewhere else. Before he could follow, Jon was startled as he heard his name being called. He turned and was happy to see Margaery and her older brother walking towards them, the older brother using a cane. Lady Margaery, my lord, a pleasure, Jon said before Margaery raised her eyebrow at him in that way of hers. Sorry, just Margaery, he said quickly, earning a smile. Much better, just Jon, she replied. Allow me to introduce my brother Willis. Willis, this is Jon Snow, Lord Jaime's squire. My lord, a pleasure, Jon said with a bow. I've heard a lot about you, Jon. Loras and Garland both can't stop talking about the tourney. And the squire's duel and Margaery said you were most kind to them during their visit. Willis said, and Jon smiled sheepishly. I was lucky in both cases, my lord. The tourney and in meeting Margaery and your brothers. They made it more bearable. Nonsense, Jon. You give yourself too little credit. You won the tourney due to your skill, and you were very gracious to my brothers and I, Margaery said, and Jon smiled at her. What kind of dog is that? Willis said loudly as Ghost strolled towards them. No, a dog, my lord, a dire wolf, Jon said as Margaery looked on in wonder. Ghost, say hello to Margaery, he added as the wolf made its way towards her and licked her hand, much to her delight. Jon watched as she began to pet the wolf and could see her growing more and more comfortable with him. Oh my, his fur is so soft, Margaery said, her smile beaming as the wolf lapped up the attention. Is it truly a dire wolf? Willis asked. Aye, my lord, it is. From north of the wall. My uncle Benjen sent it to me. I never thought I'd see one, Willis said as he leaned down to pet the wolf. Ghost looked to Jon and then to Margaery, seeing them both smile. He allowed the man pet him. The three of them played with Ghost for a little while, Margaery giggling adorably as Ghost repeatedly grabbed Jon by the hand. After a while, though, they had no choice but to take their leave. I shall see you at the wedding then, Jon, Margaery asked. You will? I'll look forward to it, Jon said. It was a pleasure meeting you, Jon, and you too, Ghost, Willis said, while looking at the wolf in awe. You too, Lord Willis, and I thank you for sending me Winter. Winter? Margaery asked confusedly. Aye, Lord Willis sent me a fine courser. I've named her Winter, Jon said, smirking. Winter, of course you did, Margaery laughed. You're more than welcome, Jon. I hope she serves you well, Willis said, before they said their goodbyes. Jaime. The morning of the wedding was upon them, and Jaime checked to make sure his gift was ready. He'd spent a lot of time and effort trying to find what could be considered a suitable gift for the bride and groom. Jon had told him that Ser Jorah would approve of anything he gave them, but Jaime wasn't sure he would. The necklace, though, was exquisite and was worth a small fortune, so at least they'd know he had made an effort. When he was ready, he headed for Jon's room. He'd been surprised Jon had bought a present for the wedding, but then again, he really shouldn't be. Not only was the groom one of his father's bannermen, but Jon was the kind of person who preferred to give presents rather than receive them, as the number of stuffed animals his cousin had would certainly attest to. Finding the room empty, he walked downstairs to see Jon talking with their guards, dressed and ready to go. Morning, Jon, lads. You ready? Aye, my lord, shall we? Jon said as they left the inn. They arrived at the reception hall with moments to spare, the gift-giving just about to take place. It would no doubt be done in both closeness to the family and then order of importance, so they had some time to go. Sitting down, he called a serving girl over and got her to bring him wine and some juice for Jon, smiling as he saw Jon ask for some meat for Ghost, much to the wolf's pleasure, judging by its expression. Sometimes looking at the wolf Jaime felt as if it was far more intelligent than any animal had the right to be. He had noticed already that when meeting with people that may prove untrustworthy, the wolf immediately raised its hackles, and though it did not bark or make a sound, its teeth would show, and it would seem to be growling. After what to Jaime seemed like an age, he was called, and he and Jon made their way to the high table to present their gifts. He wondered what was in the package. Jon carried, as it seemed, rather large and quite soft, some clothing of some sort, perhaps. He walked to the table and handed his own gift to Lady Lyness, who opened it and thanked him before Jon moved to do the same. Jaime stepped back to watch. "My lady, our homeland is beautiful and wild and will be enhanced, no doubt, by your presence. However, if there's one thing that can't be changed about it, then it is that the weather takes a lot of getting used to. Speaking as someone who found, when moving to the west, that he was unprepared for the change, I offer you this so you'll be more prepared than I," Jon said as he handed her the package. He actually watched as both the lady, her betrothed, and the room itself seemed eager to see just what it was that this young man had gifted her. As she opened the package, he, along with the lady herself, gasped. The coat was beautiful, white fur lined its collar, hood, and cuffs, and the fabric itself, though obviously warm to wear, seemed light and airy. "I thank you, young man. It's a wonderful and very thoughtful gift," Lyness said, her smile beaming as she turned the coat over in her hands. "I thank you as well, Jon, for making my bride smile this day." Ser Jorah said, his smile as large as Lyness's. "You're more than welcome, Ser Jorah, my lady. I wish you both the best of fortune and many happy years to come." Jaime smiled as he looked around the room. The lady and her betrothed were more than happy, but it was the expressions on other faces which interested him. Lord Leighton was looking on with approval, while Lady Olenna's expression seemed more intrigued. He looked to see most of the room whispering to each other and knew they'd be speaking of this for the rest of the day. Whatever other gifts the lady received today, none would match the thoughtfulness or simplicity of the gift Jon had given her, and Jaime felt the pride well up in his chest at what his king had done. Marguerite. The wedding was beautiful, the starry septum magnificent. Her aunt had looked absolutely radiant, and yet as the feast began, Marguerite couldn't help but think of Jon Snow. The gift he'd given her aunt was like nothing she'd seen before. When she finally got the chance to see it up close, she'd been amazed at how beautiful it was. It was as soft as ghost's fur and just as warm, she'd wager, but it was the little details which stunned her. Little beads that sparkled had been built into the coat to make it shine. Jon had somehow understood that practical didn't have to mean ugly, and her aunt adored it. She looked around, trying to find where he was, but couldn't see him anywhere. Lors had been sitting beside her, but had disappeared somewhere a while ago, and Willis was speaking to their father, trying no doubt to get permission to leave before the dancing began, which made her feel so sad for her brother. He deserved so much, yet he'd feel terrible sitting there while around him people danced and made merry. Her father, though, was not in the mood to agree by the looks of things, and Willis reluctantly took his seat back at their table. She had hoped Jon would be placed with them as he had in Casterly Rock, but apparently her grandfather felt a bastard shouldn't sit with trueborns. So instead she was sat at a table full of idiots like her cousins and Dickon Tarley. At least if his brother Sam was here, she'd have someone to converse with. When the dancing began, she saw Lord Yangtag to the floor with one of her older cousins. The look on his face, priceless. He clearly seemed to want to be anywhere but here. She nodded to him as she reluctantly accepted Dickon's offer and made her way onto the dance floor. He must have stepped on her toes 5 times during the dance, and his conversation was dull, but she smiled and bore it well, just like the lady she was. When the dance was over, she made her way over to Lord Yami's table. Perhaps Jon would be over there, but when she got there, she saw he wasn't and moved to go back to her own. As she did so, though, Lord Yami smiled at her and nodded with his head to the door on the left. She looked to him again to be certain she had understood him, and he nodded again. "My lord," she said with a smile. "Lady Marjorie, I hope you have a pleasant night." She hurriedly made her way to the door, and as she walked through it, she heard laughing from the large doors that opened into the gardens. Whatever was happening out there was apparently much more fun than the wedding inside, so she walked out to investigate. When she got out, she found Jon, Samwell Tarly, Loras, and a couple of other boys she didn't recognize along with Jon's guards. All of them were watching as ghosts chased after what appeared to be moths. "He'll never catch them," she said, causing them all to turn her way. "I wouldn't bet on it." "Marge, he's very quick." Lorzira said, smiling as the little wolf jumped up, barely missing, grabbing one of them. Lady, Marjorie, I didn't expect to see you here. Samwell stuttered adorably. Oh, and why's that, Sam? Is this no place for a lady? She teased. No, it's I. No, my lady. Careful, Sam, I found out quite quickly that Marjorie won't accept people telling her what she can't do. Jon smirked at her. Oh, did you now? Just Jon, Marjorie said as she looked him right in the eye while trying her best to keep her face straight and unamused. Aye, I did. Just Marjorie, he said, making her laugh. She moved closer to them, and Jon took off his coat and put it on the small wall so she could sit on it without dirtying her dress. She smiled at him and sat down. After a few moments, Ghost finally caught a moth and within seconds spat it back out. They all laughed, both at the moth flying off to safety and the look on the wolf's face as he realized that moths were not the tasty snacks he had thought they were. They spent the next hour or so out there laughing and joking with each other, before finally they had to make their way inside. Samwell said his goodbyes to Jon and the other two lads who turned out to be Blackwoods from the Riverlands who had only gone to the wedding as their ship had been delayed, turned and bid them farewell. Loras and Jon entered the hall and walked to where Willis was sitting, looking bored. The dancing was still going on, and she hoped Jon would ask her to dance again, but she was disappointed when he did not, though he explained his reasoning as he bid them good night. I'd like to dance with you, Marjorie, truly I would. But here in this hall I doubt it would be allowed. I understand, Jon, but you would dance with me, if you could, wouldn't you? She asked hopefully. If I could, then there's nothing that would stop me. Good night. Just Marjorie. Good night, just Jon, she said sadly, as she watched him leave the hall. 2091 AC. King's Landing. Jon Arryn? Jon sat looking at the accounts and frowned. In not even 2 years, they'd already managed to borrow almost 400,000 gold dragons from the Tyrells. At some point, something would have to give. He knew that despite their alleged willingness to be good subjects of the crown, the Tyrells truly only had one goal in mind, in lending that money. They wished their golden rose on the throne. Jon had no problem with that, as it would alleviate a lot of potential problems. Not only was the Reach wealthy and strong, but it also provided most of the food they consumed in King's Landing. Tying the Tyrells to the crown would ensure Robert's dynasty for years. With the Vales, Stormlands, Riverlands, Westerlands, North and then the Reach all tied into each other through marriage, it would leave Dorne as an outlier. The problem, though, was Robert wouldn't go for it. No matter how much Jon prodded and cajoled, Robert would not marry a Tyrell into his family. Not only did both he and Stannis not forgive them for besieging their home, but Robert had his heart set on a Stark bride for Joffrey. No matter how much Jon tried to explain the benefits, it seemed Robert was still living in the past, and Jon felt the specter of Lyanna Stark's ghost hanging over them always. My lord, Lord Baelish is here to see you. Good, send him in. Peter had been a godsend ever since he'd brought him from the Vale. Not only had he helped with the financial state of the crown, but did so to such an extent that Jon had tried to have Robert appoint him Master of Coin, which, for now at least, had been put on hold. So instead, he had begun working on expanding the income from trade, just like he had in Gulltown. His arrival had also improved Lace's mood so greatly that she and Jon had been getting on much better together. So much better that they had even began trying for a child yet again. A few days ago, he had been overjoyed to learn that Lisa was with child, and unlike her other pregnancies, Jon actually felt hopeful for this one. My lord Hand, Petter said as he entered the room. Oh, Petter, it's good to see you. Come sit. Some wine? No, my lord. Thank you all the same. Pittir said as he sat down. I wanted to discuss the finances again, Pittir. We needs must rein in our spending, or try to raise more coins somehow. Indeed, my lord. But how? Pittir said before looking at him thoughtfully. Actually, come to think of it, my lord, there are a couple of things we could do. We could increase the shipping taxes for docking and access to the trade in King's Landing. That would raise some coin, and we could also stretch out the loan repayments to the Iron Bank. It would of course mean more interest overall, but it would give us more funds for now, Pittir added. Jon sat there and wondered if this was a good idea. The Iron Bank would squeeze them and the Tyrells would offer better terms. If only the Lannisters hadn't shut their support off. As he sighed. They really had little choice, though. The more they relied on the Tyrells, the bigger the problem they would have if Robert didn't come around. Could you handle it, Pittir? Make a visit to the Iron Bank as our representative? Of course, my lord. I'd be delighted to. Thanks so much, Pittir. I won't forget this. I'll keep the king informed of your good work. We'll get you on the small council yet, my boy. Jon said, smiling fondly at the young man. "Thank you, my lord. How fares your lady wife?" "She's well, Pettier. Both Maester Coleman and Grand Maester P.A. Sel say her and the babe she carries are doing well." "Well, that's great news. I shall pay her a visit before I leave for Brovos. She'll be delighted to have you. Why don't you have dinner with us both tonight, Pettier?" "You honor me, my lord. I shall take my leave if that's all, Lord Hand." "It isn't. Thank you again, Pettier. You've been most helpful, as always. I live to serve my lord." Jon smiled as the young man left his solar. Pettier always managed to leave him in better spirits than he found him in, and he was very happy for both the man's help and company. He reached over and turned back to his financial reports. The Queen's expenses were almost rising as much as Robert's ever since her family stopped paying for everything. He would have to speak to the woman, as distasteful as that was. Ever since the birth of the king's second son, a couple of moons ago, the Queen had been even more irritable than normal, and a conversation telling her to rein in her spending was perhaps something that could hold for a little while longer. He hoped. He reached over and poured himself a glass of wine. Unlike Robert, he had no real taste for the stuff, but found lately a glass or two would alleviate the growing headache he felt when dealing with the royal family. Varys walked through the Red Keep. He was frustrated and becoming more and more annoyed lately. Though to see him, you'd never know it. His skills at hiding his true feelings having been developed over many years. His latest frustrations had been regarding events in the West. No matter how much he tried, he couldn't understand what was going on with the Lannisters, what game it was they were playing, and it annoyed him no end. Between that and not being able to locate the Targaryen children, it added up to headache after headache for him. He had tried everything he could think of to both find the children and get some insight into what the Lions were up to. However, time and time again, he'd been frustrated, a feeling he was having more and more lately with some of his plans. He had attempted to place as many of his little birds in the West as he could, and yet couldn't get them close to where they needed to be. Someone was stopping him, and he couldn't figure out how the Lannisters got so good at the game with Tywin. No longer running things. To make things worse, the more he heard about Jon Snow, the more the boy perplexed him. When he had heard the young man had been taken on as Jaime Lannister's squire, he had been intrigued. Though, when he heard the result of the squire's duel at the tourney at Lannisport, it made sense. Of course, the Kingslayer would recognize a boy with a gift for swordplay. But certain stories and information regarding the boy was making him question just whether that was the only reason he had chosen him. The reopening of the mines at Castamere was something no one had expected. Tywin Lannister couldn't come up with a solution to the problem he himself had created. And when the news came that not only were the mines once again producing, but that the idea of how to do so came from the mind of Jaime Lannister's squire, people, Varys included, were in complete disbelief. Surely this was some kind of jest. There was no way a child could come up with a solution when even the greatest of maesters could not. But it was apparently true. Jon Snow had succeeded where others had failed, and in one stroke had made the Lannisters more than thrice as rich as before. The mines at Castamere weren't just producing gold and silver, they were producing more than the rest of the West itself. In some ways, Varys admired the boy. Children were special to him, and to see one achieve such a thing made a part of Varys's heart soar, but it just added to the mystery of the boy, and it made him more determined than ever to get to the bottom of it. His walk had taken him almost around the entire keep, and he had found no respite or answers to the questions in his head. He turned to walk back to his rooms, only to see someone he was in no mood to meet. "Ah, Lord Varys. It's good to see you," Petyr Baelish said, his smile as mocking as the bird of his sigil. "You too, Lord Baelish," Varys replied, meaning anything but. "How fares the Queen and the new prince?" Baelish asked, the smirk on his face even wider. "Very well, my lord. His grace is full of joy with his new son." "I'm sure he is, my lord, and with the hand also set to welcome a child, the keep is full of fatherly love, it seems." "Indeed, Lord Baelish, it would seem it is. But I'm sure you're a busy man." "My lord, don't let me keep you," Varys said and nodded. "Aye, it's true, I must leave and make my arrangements. I'm off to see some bankers, it would seem," Baelish said before walking away. For a moment, Varys considered arranging an accident for the man. The simple truth was that a man like Littlefinger, left unchecked, would see the realm fall into chaos. However, now was not the time for such actions, and the man held little power anyway. He continued walking down the corridor and eventually decided that he would need to pay a visit to the West himself. In disguise, of course, but he must find out what was going on there. Before he could concentrate fully on finding the Targaryen children, a spider had many webs to spin. He mused, Davin was more and more sure that getting involved with Cersei Lannister had been the worst mistake of his life, and he cursed his cock for getting him into this mess. The woman was a terrific lay, probably the best he ever had or would have, but she was also cruel, vindictive, and he was starting to think more than just a little bit crazy. Not content with cuckolding the king, she actually went out of her way to have him fuck her when they could get caught, and while the thrill of danger was an aphrodisiac when he was thinking with the wrong head, it would also cost him the right one if he didn't put a stop to it. This was what had led to his latest predicament, and now as he wiped the blood of his injured forehead, he knew that perhaps it was time for him to head back to the Westerlands. The problem, of course, was what would the crazy bitch do when he left? While to him, their affair had been purely sexual. Despite it resulting in 2 children that he actually cared about, to Cersei it had developed into some intense love story. Just earlier that day, before she threw things at him, she was telling him how they needed to take care of the king so they could rule together. And Devin had done his best not to laugh, as if that would ever be a possibility. If the king died and she tried to put him anywhere near the throne or herself afterward, Devin would most certainly end up at least a head shorter. So he had tried to talk her out of it, and instead had done his best to divert her attention by fucking her as best he could. This did at least have the benefit of shutting her up for a while, but once they were finished, she had started right back where they had left off. "My love, we really need to kill the fat oaf. Don't you want to be able to do this all day with no one to stop us?" Her voice soft and seductive. "Of course I do, but we can't. My queen. It would never work out. I would be Queen Regent, Davin. I would decide everything. I could appoint you to the King's Guard, and then no one could send you away from me." "I don't want to join the King's Guard," Davin said, shaking his head. "Why would I? We could be together then. No one could say anything, and we wouldn't have to sneak around," Cersei said, smiling at him before her hand began to slowly travel down his body. "I need to go, my queen. Your husband will be back from his hunt, and your guards will be returning soon," he said as he moved her hand away and began to dress. "Don't you want me? Don't you love me?" she asked desperately. "Of course I do, my love. We'll speak on this again." He kissed her softly and hurriedly dressed, doing everything he could to get out of there. "You're lying. You're just like him. You want to leave me?" "No one leaves me," Cersei shouted and started hitting the bed with her hands. "I'm not, my love. I love you truly. I swear I do," Davin said, trying to calm her down before someone heard the noise. "Then prove it. Help me kill my husband," she pouted. "I can't, Cersei," he answered as he finally finished dressing. He moved to the door, but was suddenly hit by something in his back. He turned to see what it was, and unfortunately for him, he turned right into the flight of the vase she had thrown. It struck his head, and he could feel his blood as it flowed. Get out, and don't come back." Cersei shrieked, and he left as quick as he could. As he finished wiping the blood, he passed the nursery where his son was resting. He wanted so much to go in and see young Tommen, but he knew that not only would they never allow him in this condition, the mere fact he wished to see the prince would raise some eyebrows. He had never even held either of his children, though he had been lucky enough to see them both. Tommen was a cute, chubby little babe, and Marcella was a gift from the Seven, he thought. It was just a shame that Cersei was their mother. He shuddered to think of them turning out anything like Joffrey. On his few run-ins with the Crown Prince, he had found the boy to be arrogant, spoiled and willful, and he hated the thoughts of his children being raised near the boy. But he really had no choice, did he? He was in this now, this so-called great game, and he really was out of his element. He sighed as he walked from the rooms, all this trouble caused by his damnable cock. Barristan smiled at the letter he had read. His king was doing well, very well, by all accounts. He wished he could see him practicing his jousting. Would he be like his father? He wondered. He was glad at least that Yai was putting him through his paces, and that he was taking to it so well. The news of his king's achievements made him even more sure that when he made his claim, the realm would be getting the right man. He had been as stunned as the rest of the throne room when the news came in about Castamere. When the king had heard it was his friend's son who came up with the plan, he had been overjoyed. He proclaimed it loudly and often. How Ned's boy was the one who did what Tywin Lannister could not. While Barristan took issue with being called Ned's boy, he found the pride he felt hearing his king be praised overruled the annoyance of his true father not being recognized. There would be time for that, of course, and when the truth was revealed, then they'd know that it was Rhaegar's influence and not Ned Stark's that had made Jaime the man he would be. He placed the letter over the flame and allowed it to burn. It was time for him to do his duty, yet again, and once again he cursed that he'd have the misfortune of following the Crown Prince today. "Sir Bors," he said, as he walked from his quarters. "Lord Commander," the knight nodded back. He made his way from the tower and into the Red Keep. Passing the guards along the way, he finally arrived at his destination, seeing Sir Elise smile at him, glad to be relieved. "Sir Axleys." "Lord Commander, anything I should know?" "No, Lord Commander. The prince has been quiet thus far." Sarek said with a reluctant smile. "Very good. Enjoy the rest of the evening, sir." "I will. Good night, Lord Commander." Barristan watched as the knight walked away. He sighed at the state. The order had descended to, these knights under his control were no true brothers, he thought, as clearly evidenced by Trent's dereliction of his duty. Where the knight had run off to was a mystery, and had it been a true and proper knight, then Barristan himself would have led the investigation into his disappearance. The truth be told, the man was no loss, and Barristan not only didn't bother looking for him, but didn't raise an objection when the king announced his replacement. He had at least picked a man sworn to House Baratheon this time, but Barristan did not think much of Sir Richard, other than he was a much better option, that the Queen's preference. Sir David had potential, but he was not of the Kingsguard. To think an order that once contained the White Bull, the Black Bat, and the Sword of the Morning was now reduced to this. He sighed and swore that when his king was crowned, he'd rebuild it to an order worthy of him. As he took up his position, he hoped for the best. With any luck, the prince would stay in his rooms this evening. He didn't look forward to the alternative. Joffrey was at best a troubled boy, and at worst something much more dangerous. At times he was pleasant, almost jovial, but his mood could change quite quickly, as most had found to their cost. He took great delight in making the most ridiculous demands, and then throwing a tantrum when they were not followed. Many a servant had felt his wrath, and he had begun to see them punished now, where before he would take his delight in making them squirm at the thought of losing their jobs. When his father was present or the hand was near, the boy would limit his punishment, simply sending the servants from the room with cutting remarks some Barristan was disgusted to see, the king would laugh at. But when they were busy elsewhere, or his mother was around, then the servants really began to worry. Barristan shuddered to think what would happen to the realm if the boy ever made it to the Iron Throne, but he also felt relieved to know that it would never happen. His king would make his claim long before then, and when the time came for it, Barristan would be standing right beside him. Riverlands. Hoster Tully. Hoster looked on as his son continued his rant about Ned's bastard and how the boy was going to usurp Cat's children's birthright. It was the same version of the same argument his son had made for almost a year now. Ever since that damnable raven had come from his daughter practically demanding they attack the boy. "We have to do something now, father. The bastard is getting more and more popular. If we don't act, then we'll be sorry." "And what would you have us do, Edmure?" "I don't know, father. You know what I wanted to do. You were the one who shut it down." "Of course I did. You wanted to kill a boy, Edmure. For what? For what reason?" "Because my daughter is worried about something that would never happen. You wanted to send people to kill a boy. Because of that, I have no love for the bastard. But I'll not become a kinslayer because of it." "He's no kin of ours. He's a bastard. He's not even Cat's." Edmure's voice shouted angrily. "Oh, that's true, but in the eyes of most people, he'll still be considered kin, and if I'm to face my gods, it'll not be with the stain of a dead boy on my hands." "Then what should we do, father? Should he get the Westerland support then, they could take the north." Hoster shook his head. Was this his curse? To have raised idiot children? Lysa had almost thrown away everything for that damn boy from the fingers. His precious cat was worrying herself over something that could never happen, and his son and heir was showing all the strategic planning of a fray. It was time to nip this in the bud before it got too far. "You really think Jaime Lannister wants anything to do with the North? Why, for what possible reason would he want the North?" Edmure stayed silent. No answer. Just like I thought. You need to think this through, son." "But what if he did? What if the bastard convinced him, father? You heard what happened with Castamere. They say that was down to the bastard. The Lannisters owe him now, and they always pay their debts." Hoster reached over to his glass and took a sip of the wine. Maybe Edmure had a point. Maybe his boy wasn't as big an idiot as he thought he was. He hadn't considered that the reopening of Castamere was an incredible boon to the West. It had at least doubled, if not tripled, the Lannisters' wealth. Would Jaime Lannister consider repaying that by giving the boy the North? He wondered. He needed to think on this some more. They needed more information about the boy, find out his temperament, if he actually cared about the North. The two Blackwood lads had met with him in Old Town. Perhaps they could tell him more. He'd send a raven to Tydos and see if he could bring the boys with him the next time they visited. Leave it to me, Edmure. I'll decide what's to be done with the bastard, not you. Do I make myself clear? As long as you make a decision, father, Edmure said, and stormed from the room. White Harbor. Wyman! The last year had been incredibly good to House Manderley, Wyman thought as he looked over the figures. The trade deal with the Lannisters had been expanded upon, and they had plans to open a joint office in Bravos to help facilitate more trading opportunities. The more he looked on the figures, the more he felt grateful that Jon Snow had spoken to Wylis. The boy had done them a really good turn, and he was more than happy to pay the lad back when he could. Which was why when that raven came asking for his help, he was more than happy to provide it, though even he had been surprised who the recipient of that help would be. It seemed Wyman was not the only northern lord to speak well of Jon Snow. Ser Jorah, too, held the lad in high regard, due in no small part to the present Wyman had helped him procure. Wyman thought back to their trip to Winterfell. It had been eventful, to say the least. When he had spoken up about the boy, he'd been disappointed in his liege lord. Truth be told, the man had barely acknowledged what his son had done, his accomplishments bringing him no pride whatsoever, and Wyman couldn't understand it. He had always been immensely proud of his boys. They were the bright spots of his life, his future, and he had reveled in Wylis showing in the tourney. But Jon Snow had won his contest. He had been rewarded and praised more by the king than he had his own father. It perplexed him, although that was the least he could say regarding Lady Catelyn's reaction. Wylis had done exactly what he asked, and by all accounts, the children had been happy for their brother. Their mother, though, had been another matter altogether. When she had stormed into the Solar, Wyman had been disgusted by the things she said. True, the seven thought that bastards were to be feared and scorned, but Wyman felt you judged someone on their acts, not their birth. He knew plenty of true-born sons he wouldn't trust at all, and yet this woman was screaming and raving that Jon Snow would take Winterfell. From all the accounts he'd heard of the boy, nothing could be further from his mind, and given the reputation he had with the Lannisters, it was just as well, for the boons he'd brought Wyman's family paled in comparison to those he'd brought the Lions. Castamere had made the Lannisters even richer, and when he'd heard the idea came from Jon Snow, he'd been understandably stunned. As he sat contemplating, he was interrupted by a knock on his door. "Come in," he shouted, and was surprised to see both his sons accompanied by Master Dimor. "Father, we needs must speak with you," Wylis said. "Very well, take a seat." All three men took their seats, and Wylis took out a letter and some parchment before handing it to him. Wyman looked at Wylis, who nodded eagerly, and then looked to the paper. What he saw was a drawing which took his breath away. The ship was like none he'd ever seen before. It was multi-decked and had 3 masts, the sails set out in both a pattern and shapes he'd not seen before. The forecastle was lowered, and the hull longer than any he'd seen. There were also some suggestions written beneath the drawing, suggesting how to rig the sails so it could be operated with far less men than it would seem a ship this size would need. But it was the mast and sails that were really the key. Wyman could already see the benefits of such a ship, both in terms of speed and maneuverability, and given the size it would accomplish what 4 or 5 ships did in terms of carrying cargo and do so much quicker, he'd wager. "Where did you get this?" he asked excitedly. "Read the letter, father," Wendell said. Wyman placed the drawing down and took the letter in his hands. "Lord Wyman, I trust you are well. I wish to thank you for all the help you and your family have given me. Since I've come to the West, I can think of no better way to express my thanks than to offer you this, a new design for a ship. You should find that the design, though difficult to build, will both cut the time and amount of ships needed to make a journey profitable. I hope you will accept this as a measure of my gratitude. Jon Snow." Ryman reached over and grabbed his mug and filled it from the ale jug he kept beside it. He drank it down quickly and refilled the mug before turning to his sons and the master. "Maester, what do you think?" "My lord, I've not seen the like before, but given the drawing and the instructions, I think it'll make sailing incredibly profitable." "Aye, I do too, father. If that works, we'll make a fortune." Wendell said, his excitement as clear as Wyman's own. "It'll cost a lot to build and take a lot of time, but I want it done as soon as possible." Wylis. "Wendell, put our best builders on it. With ships like these, we'll rule the damn seas." Wyman said, laughing loudly, "The Vale of Arryn, the Blackfish." Brendan was tired of receiving ravens and letters from his niece. In the last year, he'd received almost a dozen, all on the same topic. Jon Snow, when he had received the first one, he had almost ridden from the Bloody Gate to the Westerlands that day, the idea of a bastard usurping his true-born grandnephew something he would not brook. But luckily he had not been able to leave that day, and as he slept that night he thought more on it and realized he was acting stupidly. He had seen the lad during the tourney at Lannisport, and the last thing that boy would ever do was usurp his family in Byrondon's opinion. Hell, the boy seemed to hate recognition and almost refused a gift from the king. The more he'd thought about it, the more he was convinced he was right. So he had ignored the letter from Cat. The damn trouble was the letters kept coming, each one more and more outlandish than the other. Each letter repeatedly mentioned their family words like he didn't know them or live them better than any of his damn family. Brynden loved his family, but Hoster had cared more for alliances than making his family happy. And instead of living the words, had tried to use them to shame him into doing what Hoster wanted. "Tamir Brynden, how fares you?" Nestor's voice forced him to look up from his table. "I am well, Lord Royce. You?" "Good, Brynden. Good. Have you heard the news from the West?" "No, Nestor, I haven't. I care not what the Lions are up to." "Aye, neither would I usually. But this was a surprising turn of events." "What happened?" "It seems they've managed to reopen Castamere." Brynden was shocked. It had been almost 30 years since Castamere had been flooded by Tywin Lannister, the event, sending shockwaves through Westeros and cementing the old Lion's reputation as a ruthless, evil man. While he paid little attention to most non-military things, Brynden knew that for years, Tywin had tried to come up with a solution to reopen the mines, to find out now that his sons had succeeded where he failed would have both filled the Lion with pride and with envy had he been alive to see it. "How?" Brynden asked, genuinely curious now. "You won't believe me if I tell you apparently the idea came from Jaime Lannister's squire of all people, some young bastard named Jon Snow." Nestor was right, Brynden couldn't believe it. Surely it couldn't be true. How the hell would a young boy know how to open a mine, a flooded one at that? There were no mines in the north where the boy could have come up with the idea. At least not to Brendan's understanding. "That can't be true, Nestor. There's no way a boy came up with that idea." "It is Brynden. Heard it from a number of people. Apparently it was all him. That's who they're crediting with the idea anyway." Brynden smiled. Well done, young man, he thought. Whatever chance of what Cat was worried about was certainly over now. There's no way that young man would ever be going back north now. He's way too important to the Lannisters. It was much more likely they'd give the lad a keep in the west as reward. Winterfell. Linnes! Winterfell was incredibly imposing, she thought, as they neared the castle. While not as beautiful as Highgarden or even the High Tower, it had a certain sense of scale that the closer you got to it, the more it became clear that this castle was not like the others in the realm. The large gray walls were intimidating, and yet they were also welcoming, and she could see her husband seemed happy to see them. He had been disappointed that Ned Stark had not come to either of their weddings. The one in Old Town, he understood. But him not coming to the one on Bear Island had hurt her bare, and while he may not show it, she knew it. It had made him appreciate that Jon Snow had come to their wedding even more. The boy showing more respect to her husband than his father did. It was because of this that she was sure they wouldn't be visiting Winterfell for a while. So when the invite came for the Stark heir's name day, she thought her husband would ignore it, but he had surprised her by saying they should go. The journey to Winterfell itself had been hard and unpleasant, and she had been uncomfortable the entire way. But they had finally made it. She got ready to get out of the carriage, though had they been in the south, no one would have called the covered cart that, putting the coat she'd been gifted by Jon Snow on, she smiled at the warmness. It brought to her cold bones. The coat had been a lifesaver when she first hit the harsh weather of the north, and each time she put it on, it amazed her how warm it made her feel. Jer came to the side of the carriage and opened the door and helped her out. She looked out onto the courtyard and saw a man she assumed was Lord Stark standing there with his family. "My lord," Yor said with a bow. "Sir Jera, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Winterfell." "I'm honored, my lord. May I present my wife, Lady Linnes Mormont?" Jorah said as he led her to meet his liege lord. "Lady Linnes, a pleasure to meet you," Lord Stark said, kissing her hand. "I thank you, Lord Stark, for your warm welcome," Linnes said with a smile. "Lady Stark, I'm honored to meet you," Linnes said as she moved to the lady and curtsied. She made her way down the line, greeting the heir and his siblings. The oldest girl was staring at her intently. Her bearing that of a young lady in practice, she thought, her long red hair and piercing blue eyes only enhancing that impression. She was sure to be an absolute beauty when she grew older. The younger was more rough round the edges, yet her eyes sparkled mischievously, and Linus was reminded of her own sisters and the differences between them. After the greetings were done, and she had found out that the older girl was called Sansa, the younger Arya, she watched as the heir and some other boy who her husband scowled at ran off to do whatever it was that young boys do. The youngest girl, who could not be more than 2 name days, was picked up by her mother and carried as they made their way to the keep, her struggles showing that perhaps her mother made the right choice as she seemed eager to run after the boys. "Lady Linnes, your coat is so beautiful. May I ask where you bought it?" Sansa asked as they walked to the keep. "Call me Linnes, my dear," Linnes, the girl's voice said dreamily. "I didn't buy it. It was given to me as a gift for my wedding." "By your brother, actually," Linnes said, smiling at the girl. "Rob gave it to you?" the girl asked confusedly. No, Linnes said, laughing. "Your other brother, Jon," she added, noticing Lady Stark turning her head to listen. "Jon gave it to you. It's so beautiful. Where did he get it? Has he got more? Do you think he'd give me one? Wait, Jon was at your wedding." Sansa rattled questions off in quick succession. "That's enough, Sansa. I'm sure Lady Linnes doesn't wish to speak of your half-brother," Lady Stark said snarkily. "No, it's quite all right, my lady," Linnes said before turning to Sansa. "Your brother was with Lord Jaime as his squire, so I assume he turned up as part of his duties. He's such a fine young man. His gift was so thoughtful, especially for a lady not used to the northern weather." "I wish I could have gone. I'd wager it was so beautiful," Sansa sighed. "It was almost as beautiful as my coat," Linnes said and giggled along with the young girl. She did, however, notice that Lady Stark did not share her good cheer and was practically rushing them inside now. She looked to see her husband in deep conversation with Lord Stark, and finally they were inside the castle itself. They said their farewells for now, and Lord Stark signaled to a servant to escort them to their rooms. As they walked, she was surprised just how warm the castle felt compared to both the outside and their own keep. There are pipes built into the walls that fill with hot water from the springs, allowing the keep to stay warm. Jorah told her after she commented on it. When they finally arrived at the rooms, she quickly got changed into less warm clothes. There would be a small get-together tonight, since they apparently were the first to arrive, so she put on one of her pretty but less elaborate dresses, although given her husband's amorousness, she was probably lucky to end up fully dressed. "Not now, my big bear." She giggled as she swatted his hands from her chest. "I won't take long," Jorah said as he kissed her neck, right in the spot he knew always got her excited. "If that's supposed to influence me, you'll find it won't have the effect you wish." She laughed as she moved away. She watched giggling as her husband slinked off to sit on the bed. Truth be told, there was nothing she would have liked better than to just wrap up in his arms and join him. The road had been too long and far too cold, and it had been a couple of Saw nights since they'd last lain together. But they needed to freshen up and make their way to the hall for their meal with the Starks, and when they did lie together, she wanted to make it last. "We'll have the whole night together, sweetling," she said as she kissed his forehead. "Our whole lives, my love," Jarko said, and she felt her heart flutter. Later that night, the meal itself was much better than she'd hoped for. She had found the fare in the north to be more rich in terms of substance than she was used to. They sat at the Hideable, Lord and Lady Stark to either side of her, and Jorah. The children looked like they were enjoying themselves, although she did notice that Sansa kept looking at her longingly. "I'm sorry I couldn't attend the wedding, Jorah. I was called out to deal with some trouble with the Hornwoods and the Boltons," she had Ned say. "It's fine, Ned. Both ceremonies went off well enough, and my wife was happy, which is all that matters," Jorah said, and she smirked. "Both ceremonies, sir?" Lady Stark asked. "Aye, my lady, we married under the Seven in Old Town and in front of the old gods on Bear Island," Jorah said, smiling at her. She watched as Lady Stark shook her head, while it seemed Lord Stark looked on wistfully. She was about to say something, but Jorah decided to speak up again. "I want to thank you, Lord Stark. The gift your son gave my wife for our wedding was much appreciated, and Linnes and I are most grateful for his thoughtfulness." "Gift? When did Rob give you a gift, my lady?" Ned looked at her confusedly. "No, my lord. It was your other son, Jon. He was the one who gifted me the coat you saw me wear earlier. He's a credit to you, my lord. Such a well-behaved and thoughtful young man," Lennias said with a smile. Lady Stark quickly took a drink from her glass while Lord Stark looked at Jorah and herself with a look she couldn't quite place. What was that all about, she wondered. She knew, of course, like all good southern women did, that bastards were to be watched lest their worst impulses took hold. But the young man she'd met in Old Town was as far from that as she could possibly imagine. So why were both Lord Stark and Lady Stark acting so peculiar? When the dinner ended, the conversation seemed to ebb and flow. She decided, and it seems her husband did also, not to bring up Jon Snow again, and it seemed the night went much easier because of it. Later that night, as she was preparing for bed, she decided to speak to Jorah on it. Perhaps he was more aware of the situation than she. Maybe he knew something that would explain the reluctance of the Starks to accept what she knew Jorah had meant as compliments to their raising of the boy. Jorah, what do you think had the Starks so put off when you spoke about Jon Snow? Is there something I should know about the boy? No, not that I know of. I met him at the tourney. Good lad, a true Northman. You saw him in the duels, right? I did, though I was more distracted thinking about the bear who'd won my favor, she said seductively, and smiled. When Jorah began to quickly undress, her use of the northern drawl exciting him as always. So what do you think it was about then? She asked. I don't know, nor at this point do I care about Jon Snow, Jorah said as he grabbed her and they fell onto the bed laughing. Me either, my great big bear, she said as they began to kiss. The next morning, after breaking their fast, Jorah gave her a quick kiss while he headed out with Lord Stark, his son Robb, and the other boy who she now knew was Theon Greyjoy, an Ironborn hostage, although he was being treated more like a ward, much to her husband's annoyance. She couldn't help but agree with the sentiment. Though Old Town had never really suffered them as much as elsewhere, she knew that even compared to places like the Shield Islands, her husband's home had suffered greatly from their attacks. She was heading to an embroidery lesson with both Lady Stark and Sansa and had found the young girl to be a delight, eager to know about just about everything, and swooning when she told her the tale of Jorah and her betrothal, how she danced with him and he'd asked her favor, and how, after winning the joust, he'd crowned her and asked her father for her hand. To be truthful, the tale did sound like it had came from a book, but she was so very thankful that it did not. Her husband may not be what she had imagined when she was a girl, but he was so much better than she had ever dared dream. She had noticed the scowl on Lady Stark's face at various times during their breaking of their fast and their walk, but the young girl's inquisitive nature had kept her from paying too much attention to it. The Septa who walked with them was a dour woman, she thought as they entered the small sewing room. There were a couple of girls already inside, and Lennis smiled at them as she sat down. What will you make, Lennis? Sansa said excitedly as she took out a beautiful sewing kit. I don't know, sweetling, she said, smiling. That's a very pretty set you've got there, Sansa. Did your father buy it for you? No, Lennis, my brother Jon sent it for my name day, Sansa said proudly, showing her the kit. It was truly exquisite, she thought, looking at it, each piece well made and separated into sections for threads, needles, and small spaces for beads. She handed the kit back to the girl and watched as she took up her pieces of fabric. That was very thoughtful of him. Jon's always thoughtful. He sends me fabrics and designs as well, Sansa said, her smile beaming, and Lennis couldn't help but smile back at her. Before noticing that both the Septa and Lady Stark did not seem to find it so amusing, she shrugged and began to sew her own work, interrupted constantly, though she was by the ever-excitable girl beside her. You're Lady Margaery's aunt, aren't you, Lennis? Sansa said wistfully. I am. Do you know my nieces and nephews? Oh no, I've heard of them. My Lady Mother has spoken of Lady Margaery before, and how beautiful Highgarden is. Isn't that so, Mother? Sansa asked as Lady Stark turned to her. What's that, sweetling? I was just telling Lennis that you spoke to me of Highgarden, and since Lennis is Lady Margaery's aunt, she'd be able to speak to me more on it, Sansa said determinedly, and Lennis couldn't help but giggle. Ever since she'd told the girl to call her by her name, Sansa had acted like they were the best of friends, and she couldn't help love the little girl a little for it. Indeed, I'm sure Lady Lennis would be more than happy to tell you tales, Lady Stark said, and Lennis noticed a little bit of bite in the comment. I'd be more than happy too, my lady, although truthfully she should ask Jon about my nieces and nephews more than I. He's quite friendly with them, Lennis said, and enjoyed the look of shock on the lady's face. He is Jon knows Lady Margaery. Do you think he'd introduce me? Does he know Loras and Garland and Willis as well? Sansa's excitement clear to everyone now. He does, sweetling. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to introduce you. Maybe you should send him a letter asking him, she added. Oh, I will, thank you, Lennis. Sansa said, her smile beaming as she turned back to her work. If you'll excuse me, Lady Lennis. Except to make sure the girls and Lady Lennis are comfortable. I just remembered there was something I needed to check on, Lady Stark said as she hurried from the sewing room. Lennis watched the woman run off and thought this stranger than ever. Whatever it was about Jon Snow, it clearly affected Lady Stark in a negative way, and she couldn't for the life of her understand why. The boy was clearly thoughtful and conscientious. His gift to her showed that he also clearly loved his family very much, as his gifts to Sansa showed. She could understand the lady not liking her husband's child, but he was far away and surely she should be happy that he was doing well. After all, if he was doing badly, then perhaps then he may resort to the things they feared bastards would do. "Linces, for you," Sansa said, grabbing her attention. "What's that, sweetling?" she said, turning to her. "For you and Ser Jorah." Lince looked at the handkerchief. The girl had embroidered it, was stunning. A black bear arms encircling a white tower, with a flame burning from the top of it. It was absolutely exquisite, and there was no the girl could have made it all today, meaning she had worked on it for a while. She reached over and hugged the young girl, the tears almost falling as she did so. "Thank you, Sansa, thank you so much," she said as she wiped her eyes. Jaime. He had noticed it after the wedding, and more specifically on the ship back to Lannisport, but had let it be, thinking that once they reached home, Jon would pull himself out of the funk he'd gotten into. When they hard arrived at the Rock, he was pleased to see that just being around Joy seemed to bring the boy back to his normal self. However, as the days went on, he realized that was not the truth. While he was happy on the outside, something was clearly bothering him, and Jaime had begun to worry about him more and more. As he got dressed and headed down for their spar, he thought on whether or not he should bring it up, or should he give Jon more time and perhaps the boy would bring it up himself. Jarenine and Tyrion had both noticed, and even his Aunt Janna had commented, which had made his heart swell to see her care for Jon as much as the rest of the family did. He knew that was partly due to her sons enjoying having an older boy put them through their paces in the yard. Tiersin and Walder, along with Martin and Willem, had formed a tight little grouping, and unlike Lancel, who ignored them, Jon pointed things out to them, and had taken to sparring with them occasionally, much to their delight. He stepped out of the lift and walked to the courtyard to find Jon standing there waiting for him, sword in hand, and smiled, even with whatever it was that was on his mind. Jon always turned up for his lessons. He looked around to see where Ghost was. The little wolf had lately decided sneaking up on him was a fun new game, and more than once he'd scared the life out of him. He saw him thankfully sitting by the wall, although he too looked a little bit sadder than usual. "Morning, Jon. You're eager, I see." I am, my lord." Jon said, his smile true, but less full than usual. "Good then, shall we begin?" Jaime moved into position and waited for Jon to attack. The sword came quickly at him, and he blocked it before moving to the left and attacking quickly. Jon's defense had gotten much better during their time together. His movement and placement of his feet were always incredible. But the way he now used Jaime's strikes against him to limit the power advantage he had was something he was very proud of. They moved together, blades crossing, their movement speeding up. Jaime still had the edge on Jon in terms of speed, but the boy was faster than he had been at that age, and it was only a matter of time until Jaime's technique and power would be his only advantages against him. At first, Jon had reminded Jaime of Rhaegar. His ability to absorb the lessons and incorporate them into his form was startling. But the more they sparred, the more he saw Arthur in him. As good as Jaime was, Arthur was a once-in-a-generation swordsman, and he felt, no, he knew, that Jon would be one too. However, for now, he was still a young boy fighting against the greatest swordsman in Westeros. And as they danced, Jaime's strikes were having their effect. "You're tiring, Jon," Jaime said with a smirk. "So are you, my lord," Jon replied. "Oh, but I could go for a few more hours, don't think you could," Jaime said, and was surprised to see the frown on Jon's face. Usually they snarked at each other during their spars. Jaime wanted Jon to be prepared for people trying to take him off balance with comments and digs, so between them they would try to get a reaction out of one another. But here, for some reason, Jon wasn't playing along, and it bothered him greatly. He decided to end the spar and speak to him. This needed to be resolved. "Let's take a break, Jon." "My lord," Jon said, confusion in his voice. "Come, let's get a drink and speak for a while." Jaime turned and walked to the jug of water they kept off to the side. It took a few moments, but eventually Jon joined him. Placing his sword on the small wall, he sat down and took a drink of the water. The two sat there in silence for what seemed to be an age before Jaime had finally had enough. "Jon, what's wrong?" "Nothing," Jon said grumpily. "Jon, this is me you're speaking to. Come on, talk to me." I don't know what it is, my lord." Jon sighed. "Ever since the trip to Old Town, I just feel I don't know. But it's as if what I do will never matter. People will always see me as a bastard." "You're more than that, Jon," Much more, Jaime said, reaching out to grab the boy's shoulder. Look at me, you're more than that. Do you hear me? He grabbed the boy and hugged him tightly. He could feel him sobbing against his chest, and it made him want to tell him the truth. To just grab him and take him to his things, show him his birthright and his mother's letter. But he couldn't, not yet. He needed to be sure they were ready. And as much as it hurt to see Jon like this, he knew it was for the best to wait. After standing there for a while, he finally felt the sobs stop. He let go of the boy and allowed him to turn and wipe his eyes, knowing the embarrassment he'd feel to have cried so openly. It took a few moments, but eventually Jon turned to him and smiled. This one much fuller than earlier. He knew he had only fixed things temporarily, but he had fixed them and they both left in much better spirits than they arrived. Jon. Jon woke up excited. Today was a special day, and he was looking forward to it more than any he had in a long while. As he quickly dressed, he saw Ghost was already at the door, almost eagerly waiting to get down to Joy's room. He smiled and they walked down to the little girl's room. They had a whole day set aside and everyone was in on the surprises they had in store for Joy's name. Day. When he entered the room, he found that not only was Joy already up, but she was also already dressed and was having her hair combed, both to his surprise and her annoyance. No assa. Ouch, Joy said, and he giggled. Yozen, stop, ouch. Wheeze, she said when she noticed him. I'll take it from here, Assia. It seems the little princess does not want her hair combed today. Lord Garyen wants her prepared, Jon. Yeah, Alesia said, looking to him. It's fine, Elasia. Why don't you go break your fast? I'll finish it. If you're sure. Bye, Joy, Jon. Bye-bye, Asse. He walked over to the bed and sat down, grabbing the comb, which Joy looked at like it was a mortal enemy. No, Jan, ouch, she said, shaking her head. It'll be fine, princess, and when we're finished we can go on an adventure, all right? You, me, and Ghost. He smiled at her. Us come. Jan. Hey, he will promise. Promise. She looked at him for a moment before looking to the comb, and then to Ghost. Finally, she seemed to give in, and he began to comb her hair. He was as gentle as he could be. But her hair was tangled, and he could feel the comb begin to catch. So he did the only thing he could to keep her mind off the evil comb. He nodded to Ghost, and the wolf jumped up onto the bed. Joy immediately grabbed him, and the two began to play together. He finally finished combing her hair and placed the comb back on the table. It was time to take her in to break their fast, and Jerian would be waiting to start the day off with the first surprise. Ready, Joy? Yady. He took the girl's hand, and they made their way from the room. As they walked, he swung her hand, much to her delight. Ghost toddled in front of them, lost in his own world, occasionally looking back at them as if to say, come on, hurry up. When they reached the dining room, they found Jerian sitting there waiting for them. Papa, the little girl shouted as she ran to him. Morning, princess. Happy name day, Jerian said, giving her a big hug. Jon sat down beside them at the table, and Joy immediately moved into his lap. He laughed. It was going to be one of those mornings the meal came and he helped her to eat hers, which she actually did this morning. Although she didn't really allow him to eat his own as she grabbed the bacon and sausages and fed them to an eager wolf. Ust more, as she fed him some bacon. Ust more, and there goes a sausage. Jon was forced to get a second plate, which he left on Jerian's side of the table, just out of her reach. Although the hungry little wolf had no such trouble, and when his food supply from Joy was gone, he quickly moved over to where Jon's plate was and looked up at him eagerly. Traitor, Jon said, laughing as he threw the wolf some bacon. Ghost just swallowed it and gave him a look that showed cared not a jot. When they finished the meal, they headed down to the lift. Jerion carrying Joy while he and Ghost walked in front of them, keeping the girl amused. It was time to give Joy the first surprise of her name. Day, it had taken him a long time to convince both Jerion and Jaina that this would be safe, and only because of his connection with Winter had they eventually agreed. Stepping out into the castle's yard, they walked to the stable where Winter had already been prepared. Jon immediately jumped up and waited for Jerion to hand him the little girl. "Want to ride on the horsey, Joy?" Jerion asked. "Horsey, Papa," Joy said excitedly, although Jon thought that was just her natural love of horses and not because she knew what her father had asked, something which was confirmed a little later when Jerion began to place her on the horse in front of Jon. Her face was something Jon would never forget. She was more than happy, she was overjoyed, and it made his heart swell to see it. Something he could see Jerion was feeling too. "Papa, horsey," she exclaimed as Jon allowed Winter to slowly walk. They rode down the length of the yard and turned around before heading down to the joust practice area. Jerion walking alongside them just in case anything went wrong, but Jon held her firmly and Winter was calm and in control. When they reached the practice field, Jon saw Jaina with her children and Kevin's two boys were sitting down to their left and smiling at them. "Wave to Aunt Jenna, Joy," he said, as the little girl did exactly that. Jon looked to Gurion, and he was given a nod, so he pushed Winter into a trot, which had the desired effect. Joy's laughter was heard around the field, and even though he couldn't really see her face, he could picture it in his mind, and that was more than enough. Eventually they stopped, and he made his way over to where Gurion was standing. "Go to Papa, Joy." "No yawn, horsey." "More horsey later." "All right." Joy accepted this, thankfully, and after Gurion had taken her from the saddle, he led Winter back to allow her to cool down. The horse had done amazingly well, and he was very proud of his mare. "Good girl," he said as he patted her while she drank from the trough. The rest of the day was a bit of a blur. Gurion had arranged a fool to come and entertain them, but Joy didn't like the man and he was quickly sent away. She and the rest of the children playing games instead while Jon helped when needed. Finally, it was time for Joy to get her presents, and Jon watched as Gurion went to pick her up. "Want some presents, princess?" "Well, since Papa," Joy said, clapping her hands. Tyrion gave her a beautiful book full of pictures of animals that were brightly drawn, while Jaina gave her a large stuffed lion that dwarfed the one she already had. Jaime had gone with a rather impressive painting which depicted a smiling Joy, which seemed to fascinate her, especially after her father told her who it was. Kevin gave her a number of really cute outfits which Jon knew she could use. She went through clothes quite quickly, given both her growing and her ability to put said outfits through an incredible amount of punishment. Each of the children gave her small toys, some very beautifully hand-carved, and she excitedly grabbed each one and held it tightly before throwing it down to the floor when presented with the next one. Jurion's present was a set of inks and papers, and Jon looked to him to see him smirk. He knew exactly the kind of chaos she'd get up to with them, and he didn't seem the least bit sorry for it. When it came time for Jon's present, he quickly left the room, and with help from Eoros carried it inside. It had taken a moon for the carpenter to make it, but the job he'd done was incredible. The horse was an almost perfect likeness of Winter. Its coloring and mane made it look like his own horse's foal. Its base was curved so that if you sat on it, you made it move. He had gotten the stable master to make a saddle and reins for Joy to hold onto, and as he moved it towards her, he could hear her voice. "Horsey Jon." "Your horsey Joy." "Mine," she said excitedly. He helped her up onto the horse and handed her the reins. He fixed her legs into the stirrups and strapped her in tight, then stepped away. She looked at him in confusion, clearly expecting him to sit behind her like he'd done on Winter. "You ride Joy," he said, and smiled as she did so. "Horsey," she shouted happily as it moved backwards and forwards. A couple of moons later, Tyrion... When they had arrived at Castamere, they had encountered some problems. Firstly, the caverns of the mines themselves were long and narrow, and full of uneven surfaces. The simple truth was the system they would use would not work. Tyrion felt disheartened. Even though they had been making progress with the trading deals, the mines at Castamere would have been the greatest boon his family had known for a generation. Jon, though, took it in his stride. He and Ghost walked around the entrance to the mine. They entered and walked in as far as they were able to before leaving and walking to the lake itself. Tyrion watched on, wondering what was going on in the boy's head. Jon stood at the lake for what to Tyrion seemed like an age before finally returning to him. The expression on his face, one of determination. "Can we stay here a few days, my lord?" Jon asked. "I don't really see the point, Jon. As good as your idea was, it's not gonna work." "I know, I can see that. Please, just bear with me, my lord." "Very well. I'll have the tents set up. 2 days, Jon, that's all," Tyrion said. They spent the next 2 nights camped in the outskirts of Castamere Castle. Tyrion had wanted to stay in the castle itself, but in the end decided against it. He actually enjoyed the campsite. It was simple, and Ghost seemed to enjoy being out in the open. The wolf running off into the nearby woods and returning every so often with a rabbit or some small bird, which he'd drop at Jon's feet as if to say, "Clean this for me." In the evening they'd talk, and Tyrion would notice Jon looking wistfully at the mine entrance, almost as if he was lost in some memory or other. Sometimes they'd need to call the boy's name a little loudly, so he'd turn and pay them attention, while at others it was Ghost who grabbed the boy's notice and forced him to turn from where he'd been looking. He had put it down to disappointment over things not working out, and had tried to reassure the boy that no one thought less of him because of it. The wind wheels still had potential, and the boon they'd received from them was still bound to be a lot. But Jon would just smile as if he knew something. Tyrion did not, and at times he found it disconcerting. "Well, it's time, Jon," I said 2 days. "I don't think we should waste any more here." Tyrion said early on the third morning. Aye, very well, my lord. When they had returned to Casterly Rock, Jon had spoken to Jaime and asked if it was possible to take some time from his lessons. He still sparred in the morning and evening with Jaime and spent his time with Joy. But Tyrion noticed when he wasn't with Winter, he was either with Harlow the blacksmith or Malin, who was one of their carpenters. Finally, after a senate or so since they came back, Jon came to see him. What can I do for you, Jon? Tyrion asked, looking curiously at the large pieces of parchment the boy carried. My lord, I think I've figured out a solution. God, it's fine. We've moved on, Castamere. Was a good dream, but the wind wheels are incredible. We'll do well with them, my boy. No need to worry about the mine, he said, as reassuringly as he could. No, my lord, it's not worry. I see what was wrong now. This will work. Jon said and handed Tyrion the parchments. He looked at them, unable for a moment to make head nor tail of them. There were a series of long, round objects hollow in the middle, and they were connected to bellows, which were operated by the wind wheels. The drawings were incredible, and Tyrion wondered when the boy had learned how to draw so well. As he looked the pictures over, he began to see it. Air, instead of being forced in by the bellows, was actually sucked out. This caused the object to fill with water, which flowed up and then emptied into a large trough-like tray and flowed down the tray into what he assumed to be a lake. Can this even be made? He asked, pointing at the hollow object. Harlow's already made some. I wanted to show you the drawings and ask if you'd like to see it working. Jon, I would. I really would. Tyrion said excitedly. They made their way to the small well, where Malin was waiting for them. Tyrion looked on as Jon showed the man on the pictures how to connect the bellows to the round object, and then he placed it in the water. Once he did that, they hooked the wind wheel up to it. They waited for a few moments, and Tyrion was stunned to see the water begin to flow out. Jon nodded to Malin, and the man did something to the bellows which made it blow quicker, and the water flowed even faster. When he did something else, it slowed yet again. Jon, I don't know what this is. This is incredible. This will work, I'm sure of it. I think it will, my lord, Jon said, and Tyrion smiled at the boy. A moon later. It had taken them almost a full moon to make the objects, which they'd called pipes, the bellows, and the connections they needed to attach to the wind wheels. Moving it to Castamere and setting it up took another se'night. Now as they stood there, all that work was either going to be paid off or be all for naught, and Tyrion could feel his heart race at the uncertainty of it. He looked down to where Jaime and Jon were standing along with Jurion. He could see the same trepidation in his brother and uncle's faces, but Jon seemed calm and collected, almost as if he knew this would work and they were all nervous for nothing. He had to admit he admired the boy's youthful surety. He could remember when he saw the world like that, anything being possible and whatever you dreamed could happen. But he was older and wiser now and knew that wasn't always the way of things. All right, fix the last fitting together and then we'll begin, he replied before making his way to the rest of his family. It's damn impressive, Tyrion. You've done an incredible job, Jaime said as he arrived beside them. It was Jon's idea, he smiled at the boy. Aye, but you built it, my lord, Jon humbly replied. Not to be a doomsayer, but we don't know if it'll work, Jurion said, shaking his head. It'll work, Jon said determinedly, and both he and Jaime looked at him together. He watched as the wind wheels spun quickly. They truly were impressive things, and he had already sent some out to some of their Leo lords. He had found that not only did they work as pumps for water or as small windmills, but there was no telling what you could power up using them. Lord Crakell used his to power the bellows for the forge. Lord Baningford had simply used his to bring his grain stores into the castle itself, allowing for them to be milled there rather than in nearby windmills or watermills. Tyrion knew, though they were still only scratching the surface of what they could do with these things, and that eventually they'd come up with a use that would make them laugh at how they'd wasted them until then. He heard the noise of the wheels and the whoosh of air from the bellows. Time seemed to stretch on for a few moments before they finally heard the sound of running water. They looked to the tubes and saw the water flow into the lake. It works. It damn well works. Good job, Jon, Jaime said excitedly, patting the boy on the back. They stood there watching for almost an hour as the water flowed before it finally stopped. It took them a few minutes to realize that the bellows inside needed to be relined, so they decided to head off for something to eat. When they came back, the water was flowing again. On and on it went. Occasionally the flow would stop and then after a while begin yet again. Malin, unhook the fitting, Tyrion shouted. Aye, my lord, Malin said and did as he was told. Then that'll be it for tonight. There's food and drink ready for you, so go get some rest. You did great work today, Jaime said loudly. After the men had left, they made their way inside the mine to see how far they'd gotten to. Tyrion was stunned to see that they'd removed almost half the water inside. It couldn't have been that simple, could it? He wondered as they walked through the mine. I can't believe this, he said, shaking his head. You're not the only one, Jaime laughed. They looked around the mine, Jon and Jurian walking off in one direction while he and Jaime stood where they were. He could already see veins of glimmering gold as they moved on. They came to something he had hoped not to see. There were skeletons and broken bones scattered on ledges that the water had uncovered. He shuddered. The ranks deserved better than this. We'll need to give them a proper burial. Maybe hold a service of some sort. Jaime said, and Tyrion shook his head in agreement. We can get the Septon to hold a large service. It'll show people we're different than Father and that the mines are open once again. Tyrion said, Aye, we'll do that. Do you think those wheels could be used to help with the mining itself? Jaime asked. I think so. We'd need to create some tools that fit, but they'd be stronger than men, and probably safer too, until we figure out just how stable this mine is. Tyrion replied, We'll need to restore the castle also, but it looks like we'll be well covered gold-wise. How rich do you think this mine is? Eddie asked as he looked around. Very, they both heard their uncle's voice say, as he and Jon walked up on them. Tyrion looked in astonishment at the large rock Jurian was holding in his hand. The gold was shining, and he had rarely seen such a large deposit, so freely available. Jon was carrying a similar-sized rock. His looked different, he handed it to Tyrion, and as he did so, Tyrion could see it was silver ore. He had no idea the mine had both. This was an even bigger boon, as now the more rocks they uncovered there would be less that would be useless. It would seem. Where did you find these? He asked. There's a passage in the back there that Ghost uncovered. You need to see it. We're going to need to put some guards on the entrance here right away. Jurian said, and began walking back the way he came. He grimaced as the White Wolf came over and grabbed his leg, pulling his breeches as if to make him follow. He looked to Jon to see the boys smiling at him. Jaime joining him, and he realized there was no help to be had from that quarter. So, he gave in, and followed after the wolf, joining Jaime and Jon, and walking down the tunnel to the right. When he reached the passage Jurian had spoken about, he could see exactly what he meant. They had obviously been working here before his father had flooded the mines, and they had hit a very rich vein. It was incredible he watched as Jurian held a torch, and the gold glimmered in the light. A se'nnight later, in the end it had taken them almost 4 days to fully clear the mine of water, the last bit extremely time-consuming, as the pipes couldn't function correctly with so little water, so they had to remove the final bits of water by using small cups and buckets. They also had begun to collect the bodies of those who'd died in the flooding. Tyrion was shocked not only by the number of them, which must have been in the hundreds, but in the horrible realization that some were clearly children. It was one thing growing up and hearing about what his father had done. It was quite another to see the evidence of it so clearly. As hard as it hit him, it hit Jaime even worse, and Tyrion was certain that the next person to play that damn song would feel his brother's wrath. In the end, they'd removed almost all of them. He was sure and true to his word. They'd held a service where the remains were blessed by the Septon and given a proper burial. Some of their lords had come from far and wide to see the mines reopened, and he knew that more than one had hoped to get the honor of both being placed in charge of the operation and the seat of Castamere itself. But Jaime had surprised them all and named his uncle Jurian, the new lord of Castamere, much to the man's annoyance. I don't want it. Why would I? Give it to someone else? It must be you, uncle. You're not only the best man for the job, but you deserve this. You can rebuild the castle and make it a worthy seat. Jaime, I don't want a damn lordship. I'm happy where I am. Why would you give me this? Jurian asked angrily. It's not just for you, uncle. It's for Joy also. What? When she grows up, uncle, she may not have our name, but she's a Lannister, and I'll not have anyone look down on her because she's called Hill, so this is for her as much as you. She'll be the Lady of Castamere. Her name won't matter because she'll be richer than any of the damn fools, Yama said determinedly. Tyrion had smiled as he thought back on the conversation. His uncle had come round and Jaime had called Kevin in to see him before they announced it. He sat there waiting for Kevin to come in, Jaime and Jon talking excitedly about something or other, what he wasn't quite sure of, as he hadn't been paying attention. But if you use a shield, would it not limit your movement? Jon asked. It would, but the protection it offered would be better. Better than a short sword? Aye, for protection, yes. A short sword might help your offense, but it'd leave you open. Tyrion reached over and took a sip of his wine. Of course it was about fighting, he thought as he laughed. Neither of the two paying him too much attention, engrossed in their conversation, as always, when it came to swordplay. Finally their uncle arrived, Lancel following behind as usual. The boy had been better lately. Tyrion was glad to say, whatever little competition he had going on with Jon in his head. Clearly forgotten. "Uncle, it's good to see you," Jaime said as Kevin took a seat. "You too, nephew. This is an amazing thing you've accomplished." "It wasn't me, uncle. It was Jon's idea, and Tyrion saw it through." "Then let me congratulate you both," Kevin said with a nod. "Uncle, I wanted to talk about Castamere. I know you were hoping to get it." "So it's not to be me, then," Kevin said, disappointingly. "No, uncle. It's to be Geryon. He'll be the Lord of Castamere." "Good. He deserves it," Kevin said with a forced smile. "I have larger plans for you, uncle. I need you elsewhere in a much more important role." Tyrion watched as his uncle sat up a little straighter, the anger and disappointment on his face replaced with a more curious look. "I shall serve wherever you see fit, nephew," Kevin said. "I know that, uncle. I'm extremely grateful for it. Believe me, which is why I'm naming you Lord of the newly created seat of Lannisport and Admiral of the Lannister fleet. My lord, you honor me," Kevin said, the shock and gratitude genuine on his face. Tyrion thought. "No, uncle, I don't. You've always been loyal, and it's time that loyalty was rewarded. We shall divert funds so you can build a seat worthy of you, and I intend to build a fleet stronger than father's. Now will you join me in a glass to celebrate our good fortune?" Jaime said, as he handed him a glass that Jon filled. "Aye, I will, nephew. I thank you. Truly, you have no idea how much this means to me." Tyrion joined them in, and one glass led to more. Kevin was not one for drinking, really, but he celebrated like a man who'd been given a lifelong dream, and Tyrion felt that he deserved it more than most. He looked to his brother, who smiled at him. Jaime rewarded people for what they did, what they achieved, and Tyrion knew his brother would ensure he got his due when the time was right, and so he happily celebrated with his family. Jon. The dreams had been coming more regularly since they returned from Castamere. Some were strange and of places he could never imagine. Large buildings that reached as high as the eye could see. Roads that made the King's Road look like a trail in the woods. He saw shapes cut into stone that seemed impossible. Animals that he could not name depicted to such detail that he could see their eyes glisten as he looked at them. Sometimes he'd wake up in a cold sweat and for the life of him couldn't remember the dreams at all. Others he'd remember vividly. He had been worried about speaking of them to anyone, fearing what they would think of him, so instead he'd curl up beside Ghost and eventually fall into a dreamless sleep. Sometimes it would be nights between the Riz, and at others they would occur every night. The ones which bothered him most were of a woman alone in a tower covered in blood. She'd look him in the eye, and Jon would feel his heart break at the look of pain in her eyes. He'd wake from those with tears falling down his face, and Ghost would lick them clean and curl tightly to him. Other dreams were happier, of a man and a woman's laughter, or a beautiful song played on a harp. He'd occasionally dream he was walking the rock, smaller and lower to the ground, while around him people seemed as big as giants. Eventually, he decided to grab some parchment and quills, and the things he remembered he'd draw or write down. An image of a blue flower covered in ice, or a sword shining with a light so bright it hurt to look upon it. A field of ice with the largest weirwood he'd ever seen, a cave filled with stone so black it looked like night itself, and a door made of stone that beckoned him forward. As he woke this morning, he quickly grabbed the parchment and began to draw what he'd dreamt the night before. He'd been by a dock as a ship sailed in, larger and more imposing than any he'd ever seen before. It glided through the water, and all of a sudden he was on board it. Walking up and down, seeing ropes and sails and masts and men, he drew it all and placed it on the pile of other drawing he had on his table. "Well, Ghost, seems like this wasn't a bad one, eh, my friend?" he said as the wolf just cocked his head to the side. He quickly got dressed and made his way to break his fast. Passing Joy's room, he sighed. Ever since her name day when she turned 3, the little girl's lessons had gotten busier. With her father away, Jon had thought he'd get to spend more time with her. But Jaina had taken the little girl under her wing, and while he was happy for her, he also missed her, especially in the mornings, as she now broke her fast with Jaina and her children, most morns. "Morning, Jon," Alessia said to him as he entered the dining room. "Morning, Alessia. How are you feeling today?" "I'm much better, Jon. Thanks for asking, and for you help with the master." "Don't mention it. I'm glad to help." He smiled at the girl and made his way to the table. unhappy to see he was alone. Jaime had stayed in Lannisport with Cavan and Jon had hoped to go with him, but instead he'd been asked to help Tyrion, which he had enjoyed. But many had missed their morning spars for a couple of days, and Tyrion was rarely up when he broke his fast. He smiled at Alassa when she brought him his meal. The girl had been ill, and he'd gone to Krylan to get some help for her, knowing that servants weren't a priority for the Maester. After finishing his meal and making sure the hungry wolf beside him had eaten his fill, he thought about going to see Tyrion, but he knew it'd be another couple of hours before he awoke, especially with him having worked thorough most of the night, so instead he went back to his room and sat back down on the bed. His lessons wouldn't begin for another few hours, and he was at a loss. What to do? So he picked up the parchment he'd drawn that morning and looked at it carefully. The ship was incredibly impressive, but it didn't seem right. Taking another piece of parchment, he began to draw it out again. He completely lost track of time, drawing picture in picture of the ship, discarding one after another for reasons he couldn't be completely sure of. The pieces of used parchment mounting up on the floor. Jon! He turned surprised to see Tyrion standing there in his room, looking at him, worriedly while Ghost for a change sat in the corner not paying the man any attention whatsoever, almost as if he too had been lost in his own world. My lord? Are you all right, Jon? I've been calling you for a few minutes while you were just sitting there drawing. I'm sorry, my lord. Got carried away. I had an idea, and I just couldn't let it go. An idea? Eh? Well, your last idea made us rich. Weren't you already rich, my lord? Jon jabbed, getting a smile from Tyrion. Fine richer then, Tyrion said, sticking his tongue out at him, making him laugh. So let's see this idea then. Jon handed him the piece of paper and waited for the laughter to start. If Tyrion knew, he'd spent most of the morning drawing silly pictures of ships he'd never live it down. But the laughter never came. Instead, Tyrion sat down hard on his bed and looked at the picture over and over again. How did you come up with this? Tyrion asked. I don't know, my lord. I had a dream and I just drew what I saw. Jon, have you any idea what this could do if it works? No, my lord. Wait, what do you mean, if it works? Jon, if this ship is viable, you've just created something incredible. Sailing these ships would make incredible profits, not to mention how much of an edge they'd give in battle. I need to show this to Krylan. Come with me. The two walked to Krylan's rooms, Ghost finally realizing it was Tyrion that they were walking with, and once again deciding that Tyrion's britches were a tasty snack. Get off me, you stupid wolf, Tyrion said, trying to shrug Ghost away. Ghost, leave him be, Jon said. And the wolf stopped, but looked at him like he was the biggest spoil sport ever. Why does your wolf continually need to eat my clothes, Jon? He's just playing, aren't you, boy? Jon answered, while he rubbed the wolf behind the ears. The three of them arrived at the Maester's and knocked before entering to find the man, busily scribbling down notes. My lord Jon, Krylan said as he quickly took to his feet. Master, I need you to have a look at something, Tyrion said, handing him the drawing. The Maester took the drawing and began to go over it in great detail, shaking his head and smiling occasionally before he turned back to them. I've never seen anything like this before. It's incredible. If I may ask, where did you get it? Young Jon here drew it, Maester, Tyrion said. And Krylan looked at Jon, stunned. My lord, this would change the way fleets work, for trade, for warfare. Ships like this would completely change it all. So you think that it can be built and would be worth doing so? Of course, my lord. We should be doing it as soon as possible. It'll take a lot of work, but it can be done. I have no doubt it'd work, my lord. Tyrion looked at him and shook his head before smiling. Come, Jon, it seems we need to make a trip to Lannisport. I want people working on this immediately. My lord, if it's possible, would it be allowed for me to share this? Jon asked. With who, Jon? I wouldn't want to strengthen our rivals. Olenna. The last moon was incredibly trying, she thought as she sat in her garden eating from her cheese plate. The little flowers sitting around her were chattering annoyingly and not for the first time. She wondered if she should just dismiss them all. Sitting to her left, her granddaughter was wearing the white wolf brooch she had received for her 8-name day. It was a beautiful thing. Olenna would admit, but it was the boy who'd gifted it to her that was causing her most of her concern. When news had reached them of the boy's achievement in reopening Castamere, Olenna had for the first time she could remember been completely lost for words. How a boy of her granddaughter's age had managed such a thing was beyond not just her, but Highgarden's Maester, and she knew those other gray rats at the Citadel had tried and failed before, much to the old lion's chagrin. How is this possible, Maester Lamis? Mace asked. I don't know, my lord. I've never heard of such a thing. Wing wheels small enough to be built and constructed on the move. It's never been done before, the Maester said, shaking his head. No, mother, I don't. Her son shook his head, and she shuddered. It means this boy has just made the Lannisters richer than ever, Mace. What will they do with that money? I don't know, mother. Maybe they'll try and buy influence with the king. Mace said, looking at her both in hope that he'd reached the correct answer and fear that if he had, and what that would mean to their plots. No, I don't think it'll be that. She shook her head. They already had influence and gave it away for some reason. Then what, mother? I don't know, Mace, Olenna said angrily as her son quivered slightly at her tone. That was the thing. She had no idea. And as most things regarding both the Lannisters and Jon Snow had lately, it bothered her no end that she could not see the game they were playing. Her mind went back to the young man in question. She knew, of course, that he and her grandchildren had been friendly and that he was as any young man would be, enamored of her granddaughter, even if at his age he wouldn't understand why. It had bothered her to see that her precious Rose felt something similar for the boy. Though given the distance between them and the fact of their ages, she hadn't felt the need to keep them apart just yet. When the boy had come to the wedding, she had been surprised, but the boy was courteous and respectful, and the gift he'd given young Linus was thoughtful. Even Olenna had been impressed. After the wedding, she had noticed her granddaughter was a little more subdued than usual. But after a while, she had come back to being more like herself, and Olenna had put it down to travel. And the fact that back at Highgarden they had no big events planned for a while, she had quickly rectified it and held a number of balls and noticed that her granddaughter's mood soon improved. When her name day arrived, Olenna had thrown the largest feast she could to ensure her granddaughter's happiness. They had given her incredible gifts, jewelry, books, dresses, fabric, and yet, once again, it was a bastard boy's gift, which was the most cherished.
My lady, a gift from a friend,
the man said, carrying a small box to her granddaughter. I thank you, sir. May I ask the friend's name? Margaery asked. Of course, my lady. The lad said his name was just John. The man said, and Margaery smiled, beamed at him. Good, sir. Please enjoy the feast. Margaery turned and opened the box. Look, grandmama, the girl said as she walked towards her holding the brooch in her hand. However, in the end, she'd said nothing. And when she heard of the events in Castamere, she felt vindicated in her choice. The boy was someone who could in time be a good friend to her house, and if he felt something for her grandchildren and Margaery in particular, all the better. Far easier to manipulate a friend than an enemy. Grandmother, are you well? Margaery asked concernedly. What's that squealing? Are you well, grandmother? You seem a little distracted. Oh, it's nothing, dear. What are you and your friends talking about? We were just speaking of attorney grandmother, wondering when father may hold one. I'm sure if you ask him, Sweetling, he'll hold one soon. Olenna answered, and noticed the look in her granddaughter's eyes. Mace would be holding a tourney very soon. She knew now, and she smiled. Her thoughts once again turned to Jon Snow and the Lannisters. She was getting nowhere. She'd set some of her spies up to gather what details they could on either, and not one had brought her back anything of note. The Lannisters were moving into trading more, and now, with the additional income from Castamere, would no doubt seek to invest it, which gave her some openings, she thought. But it was Jon Snow himself that really interested her. She needed to know more about the boy. Her efforts to find out who his mother had been were so far unsuccessful, with Ashara Dane seeming the most likely, given both the boy's looks and his father's reluctance to name the woman. Honorable Ned Stark would never speak badly about the dead. She thought to herself. She had spoken to her grandsons about the boy, and they all had said the same thing. He was someone they liked, and in some cases it seemed admired, as both Garland and Loras spoke fondly of the spars and the duel itself. Even Willis, who was much more sensible than either of her other grandsons, had nothing but good things to say of the boy's temperament. She needed to do something, or this would drive her mad. Margaery? Yes, grandmother. Loras got on well with young Jon Snow, did he not? She asked already, knowing the answer. He did, grandmother. Jon's easy to get on with, Margaery said, smiling. Do you think he'd be open to squiring for Jaime Lannister? I think he would, grandmother, but Jon is already squiring for Lord Jaime. He's but surely an important man, such as Lord Jaime would be able to have 2 squires, and with Jon and Loras getting along so well, I'm sure they too would enjoy each other's company. She looked on as her granddaughter looked confused before she nodded at her. Good, it was settled then. Margaery would speak to Loras and she'd work on Max. Loras no doubt would be quite eager to be trained by a man such as Jaime Lannister. Boys and their swords, she snorted. She would speak to the boy before he left. There would be no need to tell him to get close to Jon Snow. That it seemed was already done. Instead, she'd insist he send letters back, let them know how things were going, what was happening at the Rock, and how he and Jon were getting along. She'd learn more from Loras's letters and visits than she ever would from spies. She reached over and grabbed a particularly nice piece of soft cheese and placed it in her mouth. The taste of it divine, and the headache she had been nursing for a while started to fade away.